Good afternoon. My name is John Vogler. I'm a researcher here at the Center for Geospatial Analytics. I'm going to quickly turn it over to Jeff Assoc. He's research librarian at NC State with special love for GIS and mapping. And he's going to be introducing our instructors today. So, welcome.
Okay. Thanks, John. So great turnout. Glad to see everybody here. I just want to say a few things to start us off. The way this kind of came about, I'm on a metadata committee that the state has been working on creating the metadata profile for the last several years. And so these three here are also on that committee, and so I said we really need to have a workshop at NC State on metadata. It would be very valuable. So I've got Dr. Mulrooney from NCCU and Sarah Wray from NCDOT and Chelsea Duncan also from NCDOT with us today. So really welcome them being here. I want to tell you two very short stories about metadata. One is that I remember as a kid, and probably a lot of you do too, my grandmother and my mother writing on the back of photographs the names of who was in the photograph. It was very common, and they spent a lot of hours doing that. And they've both passed away now, but at the time I remember, making jokes with them and saying, "Why are you writing, Dr. Uncle Virgil's name on the back of this picture? Everybody knows that's who that is." And she said, "One day you're going to want to have this. It'll be valuable." So I guess that's now, because I'm very much now appreciate the work that they did. And I think that's metadata when you write stuff like that on the back of a picture. And then the other story is just how much I came to appreciate metadata when I started working at the library, and especially machine readable metadata, because I started needing to catalog a lot of data that we were receiving, and so anything that came in with an XML file or something that was machine readable, so I could do some batch processing and put that into our catalog, it became very useful. And that's when it really struck me just how valuable the metadata is, not just for internal purposes, but for other people looking for data. So that's one of the reasons I really am an advocate and encourage people to create it and use it. All right, I'm turning it over to you folks, and thanks again for being here.
All right. My name is Tim Mulrooney. I'm an associate professor over at North Carolina Central University, and I got my start in metadata working for the military and environmental program probably about 15 years ago, and we were asked to start to create maps, and then someone at the Pentagon basically asked us where to get these data from, and previous people didn't have any information, and people at the Pentagon don't like to hear the words, "I don't know." So we had to go redevelop the data, GPS, visit all these places. It took me to Kentucky, Puerto Rico, New York, all these other places to go and redevelop these data. So starting in my office, I became our metadata expert, and I started to do, I was talking to Chelsea about, I used to programmatically access VBA elements because my boss would say, how many elements were created before 2002, or how many, purposes weren't auto-populated. It's really hard to go through and individually click on each entry and toggle through each individual element. So I started to write this to Excel and do access, do information on that. When I went back for my PhD, I had an idea to do metadata. So probably one of the only dissertations on metadata. And I mentioned it to Ann Payne, who was on the committee before, and she volunteered me for this committee probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I got on it. So, I kind of have a bit of a love-hate relationship with metadata. So I'll kind of introduce everyone here. Craig's not going to be here. Craig is our graduate student at North Carolina Central. We had a family emergency, but we have a grant through the NCDOT research program to provide metadata training to the state. So I'll talk about some of the assets, videos, training that we're developing right now, and this is part and parcel of that. And I'll let Sarah and Chelsea introduce themselves too.
Hi, I'm Sarah Wray. As it says, I'm with Department of Transportation, GIS unit. I'm a spatial data manager there. I'm actually chair for the State Metadata Committee implementation. So what that means is that, the three of us, I will show you a couple of slides, but basically it's the coming to you guys to tell you about the metadata and to do the training and that kind of stuff. So that's why I'm here.
I'm Chelsea Duncan, like he said. I work for Sarah with the Spatial Data Management Group at NCDOT. I was on the original committee to develop the standard and am now serving on the committee under Sarah as well. Been working on it for about four years now. So I did a lot of, lended a lot of technical expertise to the committee. Yeah, do you have any questions?
Cool. So it looks like there are a lot of people here who have experience with metadata, heard of it, probably have some sort of love-hate relationship to it. How many people work with metadata on a regular basis? I know you do. You know, I try to, it's hard, you know, usually metadata, you know, in all of our books is usually at the very last chapter, so I'm always hustling to get to that, you know, right before Christmas or whatever. So even in my classes, metadata is usually kind of looked at, you know, at the very end of, you know, everything here. So, you know, in terms of our metadata relationship, the NCCU North Carolina Geographic Information Coordinating Council, the goals was to facilitate metadata creation, improve data quality. So I'll talk about some data quality measures. Those are some of the things that I like to focus on because they're quantitative in nature. When we look at the individual 400 and some plus elements, integrate these ISO standards. So we'll talk about the actual profile. I'll pass it out. We'll kind of look at it a little bit. And preserve data investments and basically enhance data discovery and sharing. You know, and I always send my students to North Carolina One Map because you can type in keyword, spatial extent, and you can find pretty much anything that you want. So I can tell them go download schools, go look up swine lagoons or whatever, and they can download it, and because their metadata is so rich. So when we talk about who created the profile, I'll let Sarah explain that.
I keep turning around. I realize I'm looking at the screens and not you guys. So this is a huge screen. I'm from the land of like eyes and school still overheads we're running on. Who created the profile? So when the North Carolina Geographic Information Coordinating Council starts to put together committees, they always populate those committees with representation from the rest of the committees, the subcommittees, to the council. So we always have local government, state government, federal, university system if we can, private sector if appropriate, and professional associations if we can get the membership. In this case, for this metadata profile, what we were doing is we had an approved metadata standard, geospatial metadata standard for the state. Well, that standard was being put to sleep, and we were going with a new standard, and so we needed to decide how to interact with the new standard for the state. And so that's why we created a subcommittee to make the recommendation back to the State Mapping Advisory Committee, and back to the NCDOT. So who was on there? City of Greensboro, Lee County, Wray County. We actually had membership from Canada. They are just a little bit ahead of us in the profile generation and the interaction with the ISO standards. So they were actually really helpful because they'd already suffered some things, and we were able to learn some of their lessons. State government, we had CGIA, me from transportation, cultural resources. Cultural resources is really important because they are responsible for the archiving for the state and all the archiving rules. And there's a lot of places in the metadata to make those recommendations. And we wanted to make sure that we were at least in alignment with the state archiving rules if possible. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the FGDC actually was partnered with us and also helped facilitate some questions and answers as they were moving toward a new standard adoption. NC State, and you met Jeff. NC Central, Dr. Tim, as I call him. Private sector, GeoMaxim, we were able to hire probably one of the top, within the top 5, if I'm not going to say the top metadata expert in the country to serve in the original committee and help staff the follow-up committee. And then we had membership from ERISA because they had vested interest at the local and the government level to make sure we get the information out there.
Pretty much standard uses your ISO standards, your 19115 and 19115-1, your 19119. And the standard we'll talk about today also looks or addresses content standards for geospatial metadata compliancy. Typically when we're working in our catalog, we kind of there's ways that you can look at all of these. We're an Esri shop, we're in the UNC system, so unfortunately our kind of default browser metadata editor is going to be Esri for the most part. But this previous standard was adopted in 1996, and we're kind of currently migrating to the new one, which was adopted December 30th, 2016. So we'll just talk about some of the changes and some of the differences to make your data a lot more discoverable and ways that you can address it. It applies to a broad range of geospatial resources, data collections, basically services and other things that didn't exist when the CSDGM was created in the late 1990s. It's flexible, easily customizable, and it's standardized across multiple communities. So this is the North Carolina state and local government profile. What's in the profile when you receive data from an organization? What are the things that you need to know? I'm sure a lot of people know this one, but these are parcels for Camden County. So people taking intro-level GIS. If we have any folks here who created the data, all this information, what time period are these data from, and their standardization. The entries for these are going to be standardized. What these actually represent, you can see these represent parcels. How did you create these data? When were these data published? What software is used to create these? Who created the information about the data set? So there's going to be different data contexts versus metadata contexts. So like I said before, there's more than 400 individual entries that you can type in or enter in, or can be populated for these particular entries. So it's going to be a lot different than like a book or a resource that you put at the end of a research paper. Are there distribution or use constraints? So each organization has some really good verbiage as to what their use and distribution constraints are. With the military, we were very specific about the wording for these. Who's in charge of distributing the data? Are updates required? How often? How can I get in touch with the person? Typically email address or phone number. What are the attributes for these data? Okay, what are the types, the entity types, and then are these doubles, text, or whatever that we have for these. When we look at the profile, and I'll actually pass out the profile here. I've got a PDF version of it too. But when we look at the profile, I'll kind of just show some. Thank you.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Did you forget how to do this?
I've never done this. I'm not a teacher.
No, you think you hire a teacher's pet, and they say they don't know how, they've never handed out stuff. You gotta.
I call myself a teacher's pet.
No, we good? We have enough?
It's a little harder to read with the black and white, but when you go to profile at the NC1Map website through metadata, you'll see the green elements are going to be your required elements. So elements such as the title, publication date, custodian, online linkage, the abstract. And this profile gets very specific as to the different types of entries, and also has domain tables for each of these. The use constraints, the topic categories, which is important with the new ISO standard, geographic extent, the metadata creation date, point of contact, and then there's some fixed contact with the dataset language and the character encoding. These are optional elements, so we have got our purpose, our currentness reference, metadata standard name, process date, completeness. So we've got required elements, we've got suggested elements. So this, this PDF document, this document goes and basically talks about, what all these possible values for all of these, and then put a domain table in the back. And later we'll have a little hands-on exercise, where we'll, just kind of ask some questions and ways to, understand or possible values that we have for these. The profile is going to be intended for state government, local government, federal government. In my class, I just basically described it's going to be for everyone who uses data for, with, about North Carolina GIS data. Okay, so there's some standardization that applies to this. And like Sarah mentioned before, we work with international organizations, Alberta, Canada, and there's some relationship with the Republic of Namibia.
Yeah, you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah.
So through the NC1Map website, they got a request from the government in Namibia to, they requested they wanted permission to use the profile that we created because it was very local and state government based. They really liked the way that we broke down the profile, and as Tim will get to how we maneuvered through it. So they asked us permission to basically use the profile that we generated. We didn't know what to do with that. It came back to the committee, and then the committee, it's government, right? So it's got to go to the committee of the committee of the committee. Came all the way down to the metadata committee, and we're like, yes, please use it. It's publicly available. They don't really need to ask permission because it's on the website, but that's actually kind of cool. So we ended up making the recommendations back up through the committee cycle, and the NCGICC wrote an official approval letter and data sharing letter to the government of Namibia for use of the profile, and we actually just asked of them to let us know how their implementation went, so if they had any lessons learned that we could look back from them. So of the government red tape, it was kind of, we're like, is this real? So we actually had to do a bunch of research and make some phone calls to make sure that it wasn't, like the prince of what, an African prince asking you for your metadata. You never know. So, but it ended up being an honest to goodness request, and it ended up being approved in one of those official government documents signed off on. So we include them on the slide because that's pretty cool.
And basically, pretty much we encourage everyone, at least, students I work with, whenever they develop data, I encourage them to make their data discoverable, and so you just repeat or, try to prevent any of the duplication of resources, especially if data already exists out there. Any questions about kind of the business case for metadata? We gave this workshop at NCGIS before. We kind of had some stuff. I don't know whose it is. Yours?
Oh no, I just love it.
Oh. When you actually look at the profile, I've given out the profile. This is a link to the profile, so northcarolinawebmap.gov. And then the left-hand navigation tab, you'll see metadata, the business case for metadata. You can go download these. There's templates that you can download for parsing and different types of features. And I think people have it for different software applications too. But when we look at when we look at the document, it's got acknowledgments. This basically gives a brief history of it, the value of compliant metadata, the standards, how it was built based on pretty much the ISO standards combined with some of your CSDGM. And then we have a combination of our geospatial data, and we distinguish those from our geospatial services. And we have our code lists, reference documents, XPaths, and our feature catalog that describes some of the entities there. But when I broke this down, because I'm looking to present this next week at another conference in Winston-Salem, for intro GIS users, I wanted to kind of just break it down into, these are some of the examples of the profile. These are kind of the big points here. And typically for the publication date, it's going to be required, and the format's going to be in a couple different types of formats. Year, with the dashes or without. If it's not known, it has specifications for those. An abstract is required. So as you read this document, read these tables, these are some of the big bullet points that we have. The status is required, and there's only possible values like historical archive, required, planned, ongoing, completed, under development, and obsolete. The topic category is taken from one of the ISO standards, and it could be one of 23 possible values, so it's required. Our maintenance frequency is required to be one of only 12 possible values. Use constraints is required. A process description is required as a free text entry. So these are just some of the big bullet points for our geospatial metadata, and then we differentiate those from geospatial services. So the metadata scope needs to be service. The service type must be populated. Right now we're working on the code list for those, and the online function codes required from a domain of one of 5 possible values. It could be download information, offline access, order, or search. So this standard differentiates between your geospatial data and services, which your CSDGM obviously doesn't. When you look at the table, and this is pretty much a breakdown of the table, we've got the element right here. We've got a data type, and then what Chelsea and Craig went through and did, they went through and put in examples of the best practice for a possible title. So they went and populated all these best practices. What's a good example of a title?
And that was really important to the committee. It's not just to say, put a title in there, right? It's hard enough to tell people to document their processes and their work. But at least what we could do is show them what a title looks like and what we would say a good title is. We actually had discussions about things like spell out the acronym in your title. Don't have in your title everything be just alphabet soup. That you can reference it later on, but these are kind of discussions that the committee had, for example. So we spent a lot of time, one, defining what, understanding the international standard and how we wanted it to look as an implementation here in North Carolina. So did we choose those elements on purpose? Yes. The data type comes straight from the standard, the element comes straight from the standard, but the recommendation, implementation, and those examples are a lot of what the previous committee did. So we really hope that that helps.
Yeah, I think it's important because when I open up my metadata, I don't like to look at everything. I just put item description, which only has about 1 of 5 different elements, or you can open it up in our catalog, right now select data and click on item description. I don't want to go through everything, so title is one of those elements in your item description. So we've got the element name, which is going to be mandatory because it's in green, types of values allowed or free text, and then this talks about the guidance and examples for each of these. So and we've got a number of different entries here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we're going to try to hit some of the points there. The metadata scope, and if you open up this this PDF document from the web, you can click on this scope, and this will take you to a link to all the possible values for scope. This is for geospatial services, so the scope type can only be service. For the service type, it can be free text. So like I mentioned before, all the different types, I think there were 5 different types of services that you can enter in there. So we differentiate between data and services. So we've got a hyperlink code to list that gives us a set of values, and you can see that in the appendix at the end.
And then a lot of our metadata editors, those are already programmed in, and they're just your drop downs. But in the profile itself, we hyperlink it to an appendix so you can see and pre-plan if you need to. But most of the editors, it's pre-programmed for you. You just have to choose.
And we have the code list, they're linked. So they basically give us the metadata consistency, search and discovery, and that international transformation. Like I was saying before, I think it was the topic category, there's only one of 23 or 21 possible values that you can have. So if you put something that's illegal, then it'll be flagged when it's checked later. We have different code lists. So for the topic category, you can see farming, and it has examples of each. So it's got a description for farming, biota, examples of the different types of feature classes, layers, or themes that can encompass each of those. And that's towards the end of page 17 or so for the different code lists. So these are all the different codes or domains that some of these values can have. You can see one of them, this is just service. So this is required service. That's the only option for geospatial services for the metadata scope code. And then we've got other related documents. We've got supporting documents. ISO pretty much is your pay to play. You have to pay for the ISO standards. But it's got CSDGM. Those are optional elements. So we have standard publication for that. And then we've got good metadata resources via FGDC. We were at a boot camp or workshop for metadata. So we met with almost like 50 other metadata folks in May. And we really got in depth with some of the metadata, and they have a lot of good resources. It's getting a little obsolete because it still references a lot of the CSDGM. And then there's going to be other resources as available. So right now I'm working on a tool that will export certain metadata elements to spreadsheets, so you can look at those, and I'm going to start playing with some of the state profile compliance using some Python because I did it in VBA, and VBA is obsolete now with software working. We have XPaths at the end, so you can programmatically access each of the metadata elements. And those are some of the things that I'm starting to work on with Python, exporting or accessing these and writing these or checking these particular values. So we can look at the XPaths, and those XPaths are at the end. These XPaths are really different based on your standard. And in our catalog, at least I can reference our catalog, it has a number of different standards. It's got the EPA, and when we were at the metadata boot camp, we played with the EPA metadata editor, which checks for compliancy, flag or highlight some of the non-compliant entries. Looks at the 19139, the 19115, and the CSDGM, and even Inspire, the European standard and the North American profile. So there's a lot of ways that you can view those, export those using various translators. So it's got some of the different XPaths so we can programmatically access these.
So the trick with the XPath, before we get into the activity, the international standard is UML based. We didn't feel as a committee that it would be worth our time to try to train data editors, but particularly the local government level, what UML is and how to break down that kind of IT design of that notation. So where the XPaths come in is actually, if you understand the UML of the ISO standard, it helps you find where the location in the actual standard is for that information. So the XPaths are, it's the nested, almost folder structure, if you will, of where that metadata information lives. If you're not going to be programming against it and you're just doing your editing in a normal metadata editor, you may not even ever care about the XPath thing. That's why it's kind of toward the end of the document. But if you are trying to program against it and find your way through the depths of the XML, this is the way to find it's how to find your way back home. That's why it says breadcrumbs. So it tells you the structure within the XML where to find those elements that you're dealing with. It is kind of advanced interaction with metadata, but this is the kind of community I want to talk about those kinds of things with. You guys are the kinds of people that would get into the UML, understand how it's embedded, and be able to interact with it in different ways than just simply from an editor-client perspective. So I'm glad he brings it up, and that's kind of the stuff we're talking about there.
Well, what we're going to look at in a little bit here is we're going to just read the standard. So I think how many questions we have? Like 8 different questions, and we go through and look at these. But we just kind of want to look at, which of the following acceptable role code for the responsible party. So, as we kind of look at the actual standard, I like to do it in my PDF and just hit Control F and just go through and look for the word, role code. This is what the actual standard looks like, so this is the black and white. I can type in the word role code, and you can, I like to navigate this. And then when you click on the actual document, it'll take you to the end, and these are the possible values for role code. And it explains exactly what each of these are. So we've got a custodian that accepts accountability and responsibility for the data and ensures appropriate care and maintenance of the resource, or the role code is the party who can be contacted for acquiring knowledge about or acquisition of the resource. So you can see these interactive ways to access these. So the following, which is the following? I think point of contact, is that right? Coordinate format is required for, what coordinate format is required for the geographic extent bounding box? So we can look for the word bounding box in the actual document. We're at the top of page 11, and this is usually, I think, auto-populated, at least in our catalog. This is usually going to be in geographic, your latitude and longitude. Place keywords required. So if I look at the required, goes to the optional. This might be a little bit easier. Okay. Option. Top here, you can see the optional or CSDGM required features. You can see this outlined and got a background of whatever this color is here. Brown.
And one of the reasons why we wanted to still acknowledge the old FGDC standard of CSDGM is because at the time, FGDC was still approving, was still endorsed all of those standards. At this time, they are making the recommendation and making the steps to move forward to move away from CSDGM and just endorse the international standard. So as the federal government makes those leaps, we'll be making those leaps. And things that are optional because they're CSDGM, we may be dropping from the list, depending on how the committee feels about those particular items. We may just leave them optional as normal optional and not optional because they were CSDGM. So that's kind of some of the activity of the committee.
This place keyword brings up a question. Do you know how people are handling this for state level data sets? So, for example, if North Carolina, is that adequate, or do they try to fill in other counties and towns?
I don't know. It's I think it's more applicable. So of course by data set. So when we're talking with they're now called DEQ, right? Department of Environmental Quality. They used to be the DENR, right? So they kind of operate their boundaries are the river basins themselves. So their place keywords may be kind of more organized based on the data types they're dealing with. I don't think we make a recommendation for all the counties. We do. No. Our recommendation to DOT is just the state and sometimes the district or divisions. Our personal breakdowns of those locations, but we don't have a habit of putting listing all 100 counties for the place keywords, but it just takes up a lot of space. People will scroll on by. Now that being said, we have regularly published products that all 100 counties plus Band of Cherokee and such have to be in the drop-down list, so you have pages and pages of metadata, attribute, domain stuff that includes it all. So not necessarily in the place keywords, but internal to DOT, what we've been discussing enterprise content data management wise is what's an applicable place keyword so people can still find what you're looking for. So that's really what the recommendation is. If you want people to find your stuff, maybe you don't. The idea of metadata is that you do. If you want people to find your stuff, put as much in there so that if that's what you think people would search for what you're producing, populate it with that.
Which of the following elements required for documentation for geospatial services? Pretty sure it's the feature catalog. If you actually look at the standard, there's no feature catalog for the data, but we do have one for the services. And we've just got a couple other ones. What topic category best applies to zoning maps? I would like to put more zoning.
Now it's tricky because you gotta go and have the topic category.
So we have topic category, code, and then I have Control F here, so I can just go through and look for the word zoning. And I can see here it's in planning disaster. And that's information used for appropriate actions for future use of land. What's the cost of the CSDGM? Pretty sure it's free, right? I know the ISO is $100 and something or so. What is the preferred online linkage XPath? So we're getting a little bit further into the weeds here. Online linkage, and I go down to my XPaths. this has got the XPath 4-line online linkage right here. So for the metadata method distribution, you can see this UML implementation of it looks a little different than your XML. So, feature catalog is used to document and this just talks about the entity and attribute information here for these here according to 19105-1. So I'm doing a workshop next week for to beginners where we're going to kind of go through this, read this, make sure they're able to understand it. So, are there any questions about this actual document, how to read it, how to interpret it? We just got a couple of content overview, and then we'll talk about some resources. When we write a good title, I think we mentioned this before. What entails a good title? Try to avoid acronyms, abbreviations that are not commonly understood through a file name or other identifying information. So let's talk about the file name, the when, the where within this particular title.
The typo's still there, so don't stare.
Oh, okay.
It's not your fault.
Okay. All right, good.
Caroline.
Date formats. I thought this was important, especially as I start to go and try to use Python to programmatically access these. So I need to find ways to account for years. What makes sense. I'm going to parse out different years. That year better either start with a 1-9 or 2, or otherwise it's going to be kind of I'm going to flag it as incorrect. So these are the different ways that it could be. That can be represented here according to the standard. Or responsible party, like we mentioned before, there's a custodian or point of contact is required. We've got additional responsible parties are optional. They can include vendors who created it, entities that distributed, individuals or agencies that have processed or gotten their hands on it. So you can see a lot of different information. The theme keywords. So it's got a robust set of descriptive theme-related keywords, such as wetland salinity, and use one or more of the ISO topic categories, and I think I'll explain those in a little bit. And the CSDGM theme keywords should also include the ISO topic. We'll mention this in a little bit. The use constraints not indicate any restriction associated with using the data. Having worked with the military, there's always a lot of use constraints, distribution constraints attached to these. It's a lot longer than this. I know we were talking with someone at one of the folks on the committee who had to go to their lawyers and put together some big verbiage on which the use and distribution constraints should be for their particular data. So just be aware of, typically we talk about no warranties expressed or implied made regarding the accuracy of the data. I'll mention a couple things about data quality, which get into my specialty in a little bit.
But also, as you're doing research, make sure you're not relying upon something you can't use for that. So that's a place to go to look, and if it's kind of ambiguous, go to that point of contact and double check. So the last thing you want to do is get a certain way down your research and not be able to include something. So, or be able to report out on it, but be informed by it. Just make sure you know what you're dealing with as well when you're reading.
Yeah, that's why I just finished a paper and someone said, well, did you think about, margin of error for these sample data? And I said, no. And they said, well, maybe you should. I had to go back and research that at the census tract level that was blocked.
It's obviously something I've suffered, so it's you want to be able to present something and then maybe you're not really allowed to, and then it doesn't go well.
These are topic categories. I think there's 21 of these topic categories, and we have an explanation of those in the back of the standard here. Spatially referenced information, so you can see the difference between the ISO and the CSDGM. So these are pretty self-explanatory. A lot of
This is also really critical if you're just using GIS and it's really easy. You just want to throw everything into your map and see what's going on, and then something's showing up over here and something's up there and down there. You got to do some reprojection and all that kind of stuff. Chances are also somebody may not have projected their stuff correctly. all of that kind of stuff. So that's why not only is it part of the standard, but it's really important to know where you're dealing with what you're dealing with.
Metadata scope. I think this is for services. So we had model, feature, attribute, initiative for the service scopes. So we can look at those service type. And we're currently, I think, developing the code list for the service types, if I remember right. And then these are just some examples of some optional elements, such as the purpose. The purpose comes up on the item description, which is about the 5-element metadata that I always like to view. I don't like to view everything else. And the currentness reference, which is always good because someone's always going to ask you how current are the data, and obviously you don't want to say I don't know. Logical consistency, completeness, process date. These are also very important, and this was really important to my dissertation because these are some of the quantitative elements attached to data quality. These process date, the horizontal accuracy, the attribute accuracy. So when we look at some of these data quality measures, when we actually go and create GIS data, that's what we're doing with my graduate class now, is we're evolving from me just giving you a bunch of data to you actually going out and creating your brand new data. At some point in time, some jerk in the back of the room, that's usually me in class, say, where'd you get these data from? Who created these? When did you create these? How do I know these are any good? So it's pertinent that people populate these elements here. Because I'm big into data quality. Before Sarah's project, we had a project with the NCDOT where we assessed data quality for all roads, all 455,000 roads for the state. So we said, this county had the best, this county had the worst. I had a whole bunch of students working on it, and they didn't look at all 455,000. So we did some sampling procedures where we said, the counties between Mecklenburg and Guilford County were the best. All counties kind of out on the edges of North Carolina were the worst. We looked at data completeness. We developed Python scripts to go through and look at all these attributes, but that would take, and we'd literally still be doing it. We've done it for 3 or 4 years to look at this data quality. So to me, data quality is really important, especially some of the lessons I learned working for an environmental agency with the military. Because these days with a lot of sources that are spatialized, you can turn tables, tins, relationship classes, anything that just implies spatiality, we can turn that into spatial format. It's important that process is documented. These are all things that I talk about in my classes here. This is the NCCU campus. We just bought a new toy, a drone. So we're able to take pictures. We're figuring out how to use it. Kids in my class are so much, if they fly like video games, I'm really scared to kind of fly it around. These kids can have it following them on motorcycles and doing other things here. So. But this is a drone, so when we capture this imagery, we're starting. This is just red, green, blue, but we do have an infrared camera on one of them, on one of the other drones that we bought. You can see this from the NOAA website, and we just convert latitude and longitude values from the Climate Prediction Center, project these in the geographic coordinate system. This is a little thermal camera that I bought last year, just attached to a phone. So we're trying to figure out how to mount that on on the drone and take top bottom pictures there. So it's important that we've got spatial information about all of these. So these are also encapsulated within metadata. And part of my dissertation was I started to pull all these individual elements out of metadata. So when we look at the horizontal accuracy, there's only about 9 or 10 quantitative elements. This is the process date, so it's the vertical accuracy, the horizontal accuracy, how many processing steps there are, the process dates, the currentness date. So, basically I took all these and tried to process information from that and tell my boss, hey, we've got 100 layers here. These are the 10 oldest layers. These are the 10 layers that don't have logical consistency. So we can address them, because it would take me a day to really point and click, or take a graduate student to point and click and look for this information. And I'll talk about that in a little bit there. But this is just some of the data quality information we have, the process step, the process contact, and some of the contact information that we have here. What's the process description? I went and GPSed this particular one in 2007 on these particular dates.
You know what, that reminds me of one of the stories that Linda always tells, which is not only are you documenting this for the people that are using your data, but you're documenting it for yourself. Your future self will thank you when you want to pull something back up, and then you're like, what did I do with this? And you actually had the information about what you did with it, with the data itself, inherently attached to it. That's also another big win for doing that documentation as part of the data creation itself, and the data maintenance for that matter.
Yeah, that's what I encourage for all my students, because if they, as a GIS tech, they're not going to be doing a lot of analysis. They're going to be doing a lot of data development, making the actual data. You know, whether it's parcels. At some point in time, we had these big plat maps that I worked with, 15 years ago, and now they're all been digitized. You'll be updating those or updating the attributes. You can go to the Guilford County website that has a view, over with Steve, who's on the metadata committee, and within a couple of days of someone selling a house, that attribute information's been updated. They're going to be doing things like that instead of doing the fancy analysis, fire routes, and all the other things. So I'm really, to me, I'm pretty passionate about data quality, creating data, and really adding to the body of knowledge that NC1 Map can provide for everyone through their downloadable data, through their services. I had a couple discussion questions here. Some of the metadata practices. What are some of the key, or anyone who works with metadata, what is the best metadata practice observed by your organization?
Is anybody writing metadata now?
As needed.
As needed?
Mm-hmm.
That's, we were talking with somebody 2 weeks ago, and they work private sector, and they only write it if it's paid for within the contract. And people are forgetting to put money and time in the contracts for the deliverables from private sector to public sector, or between each other, to actually get the data documented that they're actually asking for collection for. So that's also an as needed, as paid for in some cases as well. And then we're left with high value, but it degrades very quickly. Beautiful, beautiful, I don't know, all sorts of planning information, and then nothing to go along with it.
We have a student working on a food desert project, and he's graduating next month, starting with Esri in about less than 2 months down in Charlotte, had an internship, and I'm trying to get him to populate all the metadata, because when he goes, and someone picks up on the project, I don't want to, spend a month going through it. So we're working feverishly on metadata, and I'm kind of holding the, signing his, thesis passing sheet until he does all the metadata. It's going to be difficult on the next group of folks there.
And at NCDOT, we don't have a data governance rule put in place for metadata right now, but that's what we'd be working toward. So if somebody is going to, right now we have business units that can publish their own data. They can publish, for example, like crashes are published from that business unit, doesn't come through the GIS unit. But we don't actually have a data governance rule in place that says your metadata must meet the state profile. So what we are looking to do is put more of that governance in place so that if something is out there, it at least has a standard documented look coming from the agency. So that's another way to kind of enforce it. Try not to be the data police. I'm not trying to prevent information from getting out there, but things as important to the public as where the fatal crashes are. You should actually know how current that data is, where it came from. Is it the authoritative source, or is it just somebody who's playing around because they all of a sudden got the permission to start publishing something? So from the state government perspective, we want to make sure that it's understood authoritative sources and that kind of stuff. So you have to weigh that with getting the documentation, people to care about to do the documentation to begin with, versus putting the governance in place. And so for us, it's getting the profile in place and then understanding how we'll be able to apply that governance back out. And that's basically the case with every federal agency we met with. At the workshop that Tim and I were at, it was the alphabet soup of federal agencies, and everybody was suffering the same thing. How to make people do it without driving them crazy to still getting it done. And even as late as this week, the profiles are continuing to move forward, and they're still struggling with implementation. transportation.
Yeah, the biggest challenge is the time and energy to populate it. So, and when I work with the military using VBA, if I'm going to be the process contact, I'm going to be the metadata contact, I'm going to do all these other, this is going to be standard. I created some VBA script that just auto-populated metadata. So I'm looking at ways in Python to do that. You know, it's a little tricky with the translators and whatnot, and there's multiple translators going from and to the metadata, but that would make life a lot easier, because I'll show a couple of things that we're starting on right now, and if you can go in the other direction where if you know particular values, then it's going to make your life a lot easier.
And the idea of this committee, as Tim's going to show you, is that we want to make it not so mysterious. Like the videos that he shows, this profile itself, it feels thick, but really it's just a table. You literally can just go down through the table. There's not that many things in there. So to make it as easy as possible to understand what it is you're supposed to do and how to interact with it, and some of the stuff that he'll show you coming up is how we're trying to make it easier to do the work so it doesn't feel so overwhelming for the people that find it overwhelming. I have no problem writing it, but I'm the weirdo.
One of the best practices that in the past you used to get metadata, and it would be in numerous different formats, XML, HTML, and then even some in Word docs. And I guess, you know, obviously Word docs, I guess, are easier for maybe the vast majority to open, but XML is the most useful, especially if you're going to use it within software, you know, be able to open an art catalog and stuff like that. So I guess one best practice would either be multiple formats or at a minimum, you know, an XML format that can be converted.
I like XML personally.
Yeah.
But, you know, North Carolina one map has also metadata in the TXT file, which is a nice and Y profile, it was developed to address the core requirements of operational metadata. And I think we have a number of the street center lines, multiple municipal boundaries and parcels. We have templates of those on the North Carolina one map, and I'll show some examples of those in a second. Parcel data custom content. We have characters defined and replaced for county name, the contact information, sample abstracts, sample use constraints that you can use in there already. So you only need to change the information that's going to be pertinent, you know, to you.
What we were finding is that there's a lot of, so we're governmental based, but there's a lot of data that comes from the local sources and then gets conflated as it moves up in the governmental systems from local planning organizations, the districts, to state level, the federal level, that kind of stuff. And so what we wanted to do is to look at the framework data sets, FGDC framework data sets, and say, is there something unique about that data set that we can then say, well, here's a template for how to fill out the template, so that it would be as easy as possible, and maybe even standardize a little bit so everybody that's looking at that that statewide parcel data set, for example, that's on NC1 map, if everybody starts to use the same constraint information, then you can kind of, we're trying to help the local governments pre-populate as much as possible so that they're really just worried about the intricacies of the things that they need to get updated every time they update. So that's why we've got these different framework templates, if you will.
Yeah, and we have, you know, different templates. Oh, sorry, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the disclaimer statement. We have a group here at the center that uses a land change model called Futures. And the outputs from that are these land change prediction maps out to 2030 or 2040. And whenever we share these with other researchers, whoever requests, we definitely include a disclaimer with these predictive maps. That basically saying they're landscape trends and not site-specific outcomes. Please use caution when using this with your own research. So it's something we do think about.
Good.
Like, go ahead.
Oh, no, we want to make sure that we're not, let me say it the other way. We want to be editor agnostic. So if somebody is using open source, we want to make sure that our template, their XML templates, so those templates can be pulled into your open source software, into your ArcGIS if you're using Esri software, The CAT MD Edit is one of my favorite. That's open source. It does really well with the template, and it provides better visual feedback, I feel, in the editing. The QGIS editor has some gaps, but it's easy enough to use, and we'll be looking to work with Boundless to kind of shore that up so that it gives more of a visual feedback to some of our profile needs. And Esri had a metadata summit out at Redlands this summer, and they took to heart a lot of what this metadata boot camp that Tim and I attended provided them probably more feedback than they were willing to accept at the time with their particular editor, and they've been able to convince their developers to implement the metadata editing changes in their actual roadmaps for the rollouts of ArcPro and that kind of stuff. So things like AGOL right now, you can publish the service metadata, but you can't reference any of the layers within your AGOL map. And so you just know the metadata about the service, but nothing about what's inside of it. That's a big problem for AGOL implementations. That is now on the Esri roadmap for release next spring. So these companies, both open source, of course, are taking the feedback, but Esri is also taking the feedback to kind of make metadata more accessible, more easy to interact with, to write, and actually the presence of it in some case to be strengthened.
Sarah, you mentioned in the last slide framework layers,
Yes.
parcels as an example. What are some of the other framework layers? Because probably
Go
some
back
of us
one.
are using some of those.
There,
Okay,
those ones.
okay.
So cadastral transfer. So these are the ISO theme keywords. Transportation, boundaries tends to be one, or like, particular for us, we wanted to say municipal boundaries because it was a data set that we had. Ortho imagery, so this was kind of our breakdown of some of the known statewide conflated data sets that we wanted to show.
And a couple things, just what's going to make, and we're always open to input about what's going to make metadata more digestible. Does it facilitate the shift to ISO metadata, and what best practices are helpful?
And for you guys, you don't have to shift because you didn't have it to begin with. So you're not meta. If you didn't have CSDGM, there's no migration. So just start with the ISO. Start with the text, the XML templates, and just load them in and go from there.
Other things, what about the profile doesn't work? We haven't had too much, pushback on it thus far, so.
No, they just want us to come and tell them more about it. Welcome through.
And metadata next steps, importing, applying the metadata profile to a particular data set, how to train your organization, so that's what we're going to be, working on, proposing. I'll talk about that in a second. The assessment of metadata, so metadata, who's completing at what extent, and then programmatically assess profile compliance. So some of the things I'm working on are just a little Python tool where we have a data set, an output file, XML folder, and I'm starting to write metadata within a database to loop through a database and write all the metadata entries to a single place here. So I did this 10 years ago in BBA, and now I'm finally learning Python in my free time. But these are some of the things that we can do. And then if any of these are quantitative in nature, we can, maybe not summarize these, but we can look at the numbers, whether it's in meters or dates or whatever, to look at, run some statistics on that information. So that's kind of my next step. My other step, what we're looking at is just turning this standard into, quantitative information. So is the abstract populated, yes or no, flag it. So within a particular database, we can say, layer 1 has, 15 flags on it. These are the particular flags. Layer 2 has 2 flags on it. and, it's missing, 5 of the optional elements. And, that's just it shouldn't be too hard. Programmatically, it's just it's resource intensive to with all the, permutations and.
And it's missing out of a lot of the editing tools that are there, be it the EPA tool. There's a ton of stuff on GitHub from the feds. There's a NASA one. There's one called GeoPlatform. There's all sorts of stuff out there. The problem is the validation. So yes, we have a profile. How do you know you filled out the profile correctly? Well, the problem with that is that there wasn't a approved standard for the schema to map it against to validate. That just was approved and endorsed. So these, the companies now and the editors should be able to start to implement the in-place validators. Yes, in our catalog there's a validate button, but all that does is produce an exportable thing that you have to do something with. So and then in our catalog there's some other things, like if you set it up correctly, it'll think that something's mandatory, but it's not particular to this profile. So what we would want to do is take, now that there's a schema to validate against, maybe adjust that for the North Carolina profile and build that into an available validator, similar to the old CSDGM validator that USGS used to have, the metadata parser. If we're lucky at all, maybe they'll update it for the ISO standard and we can continue to use some of that those validation tools. But I think this, in working with Central, and maybe you guys have some ideas, to get that validator is certainly the next step, because you spent all that time, or maybe not all that much time, what else do I have to fill in, what's missing? Or did you type in your date wrong, or whatever. To do that validation is certainly nice.
So you think there'll be a chew and spit version 2?
I'm hoping. The EPA decided not to wait around and wrote an add-in to ArcMap, or into our catalog, ArcMap for it. It's downloadable, it's free. It's tricky though because, for example, the contact list. You can have an off-site reference contact list that you link to. Well, it's automatically built into their tool, so you have the entire EPA contact list if you go to use it. So you have to kind of go in, change a couple of things, unless, I don't know, you want to make EPA your contacts, you want to do that too. But so there's some things that we're seeing out there that people were doing anyway. What we want to do is kind of, hopefully, chew and spit it out. Or ideally, as you're writing it, it tells you where to go next, so you're not having to go in and out. That was the pain in the butt with the USGS Metadata parser, was I had to export, run it through the parser, you see what line you got to go back, click through the 100 tabs, the tabs of the tabs of the tabs, and the old stuff, and find your way. Hopefully, these tools that you're interacting with will give you visual feedback as you're doing the data entry. What's missing so far is the hope. So you're not actually having to feed anything, it's automatically there for you. But if the vendors don't come up with that stuff, the state is looking to see what we can do to help facilitate getting something out there, at least for us to validate against our profile.
We've got some future training, we've got some flyers up here, but we're looking to offer training in December 12th, Tuesday, when the semester lets out on our campus. Here, December 12th, so contact me if you're interested, or maybe send some students your way. We'll talk about fundamentals of metadata components, very intro level, and we'll talk a little bit about data quality and basic metadata assessment. We'll get some real hands-on. We have ArcGIS. We'll try to maybe get some other software installed, but how to get hands-on, how to edit, import, export metadata, and these particular profiles that are downloadable from North Carolina OneMap that have been made available. So you can contact me. I think we have our labs are 16 students each, so they fill up, and then once we get our dates for the spring, based on availability of our lab, I'll post those dates and pass those along to Sarah, and we'll have those. But I'll probably be teaching it. I've got a graduate student, and once he goes away, it should be pretty easy to keep up to date and facilitate this training.
And it's an all-day training, right?
Yeah, it's all day.
So we could come here if somebody wanted us to do a lab,
Yeah, definitely,
right?
yeah.
So we could come here if there's a lab available and do a hands-on session too. It doesn't have to be the whole day, but we could do a hands-on lab as well if you'd be interested.
I'm happy to. And we've got a YouTube page. So this is our little YouTube page here. I'll kind of hit a live link to it. I've got a bunch of resources for our campus, classes that I teach, research presentations, and some of the things we've done with our drone. But we've got a metadata training. So these are some of the metadata training tutorials that I posted. Some of them are pretty basic. A couple of them talk about the XML metadata and the translators. Some of them get into the little tool that I've created. I'm probably going to update that as I try to put some more bells and whistles into the tool, how to view metadata, and how to actually use the standard. So what we went through today is how to look up, some of the basic entries on the standard. So I'm probably going to look to add about 4 or 5 more of these. What we call on-demand learning. Me, I'm in bed by 9, so if students call me after that, email me, I'm not answering, so a lot of times we're working real late at night, and, so a lot of tutorials I post in my class. I've got about 60 of those for my classes, and hopefully this would be a resource for the North Carolina GIS community. That should be, and then this is Sarah's contact information. Jeff has been useful over at North Carolina One Map, and then this is my contact information here if anyone has any questions.
Do you want to do a sign-in sheet?
Yeah, sure.
Or if you guys have questions, please feel free to put your name and email.
Yeah, I've got my card up here and other profiles and
We can send you all the links and the presentation and everything.
flyer. So if anyone wants a flyer or card or anything, feel free to take it and put my contact information there. So we can provide this face-to-face training.
Do you know of any state agencies that have gone full bore into trying to implement it?
I would think DEQ is the closest. I know that DPS, so public safety with emergency management, is certainly pays for it as part of any LiDAR or the collection. So I know that stuff is mandated in there for their, but I don't know about their real-time stuff. But I don't think anybody's jumped in the deep end just yet. We are also still waiting on NC1 map to be fully ISO compliant because they're still CSDGM themselves. And so as the local governments and the other state agencies and anybody else providing data that they harvest starts to be created in the new profile, they're going to need to be able to harvest it.
I know there were several counties that wanted to, they don't have any metadata, and so they were
I
wanting to get
know,
it started.
yeah, Guilford in particular
Yeah.
was pretty lacking, and that's pretty, it's all sorts of different governmental reasons for that, but yes, they were among the folks that didn't even have to worry about doing any migration. They could just start it at us. At NCDOT, we're about to jump in the deep end because I was told that's what it's a new assignment for Chelsea and I that we'd be doing the data governance and enforcement. That came out of regional planning organization requests as well as some executives who want to make sure that the engineers know what data they're working with and that we're not double paying for data collection and that kind of stuff. So there's a political and a financial reason that we're being asked to enforce the data governance. So we'll be ramping it up very quickly. That's how that happens. There's government. I think it's correct though. I don't have a problem with that assignment that we have right now actually. I'll buy Chelsea a deputy badge. They keep calling us the police. I just don't think that's right. Yeah, she's cool with it, so we'll give her the badge.
Oh, this is just North Carolina One Map. This is the metadata resources. So we've got ISO metadata standards for feature web services, and then these are some of the templates.
Oh,
right?
scroll up real quick, yeah. I don't know what I'm saying, you point at, it's under. So the PDFs for the ArcGIS and the CAT MD Edit are step-by-step instructions. Load the text file in here, go here, fill out these things. It's literally click here, do this, do this, do this. So those are step-by-step instructions on how to do the profile from the templates that are provided right next to it.
Yeah, we're going to try to make these videos too.
That's right. So the idea is to make them more interactive. You can interact with them a little bit better. The trick with Esri stuff is now that they're releasing more often, you never know how it's going to change. But the idea is to keep this website up to date. The committee, one of the committee's jobs is to keep this website up to date. I know the CAT MD Edit I haven't looked at since February for the conference, so whoops. But you need to go back and visit it. Or if you guys get a wild hair and you decide, you know, I'm going to take a look at CAT MD Edit and you want to send in an update, we'd be happy to take that update and post it. We're not too proud. We'll take anything we can get that helps the greater community with the information. And then we'll add you to the committee. If you want to be part of the committee, let me know. We are always looking, or if you're interested in any state level committee participation, let me know because they're always looking. They're getting ready to stand up a classified land use, land cover standards committee, for example. So always looking for volunteers.
If there aren't any questions, I think we're pretty set.
Well, let's thank Tim, Sarah, and Chelsea for being here.
Absolutely.
And I thank you all for being here too. And please, after any questions are asked and answered, get some snacks on the way out in the elevator. I assume they're still there. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for
You're welcome.
organizing.